What's up guys, and welcome back to another video. Today is a beginner's guide to getting started in photography. However, if you are a pro or you have lots of experience within photography, don't switch off just yet because it's always good to refresh the memory. In typical Friday Flicks fashion, we're going to dive straight into it, starting with the exposure triangle and getting to know it. Shutter speed, aperture, ISO are the three main things that control the exposure of a photograph, and getting to know those is essential. Aperture controls the amount of light that comes in through the lens by adjusting the aperture blades. Shutter speed is the amount of time the sensor is exposed to the light, and the ISO controls the camera's sensitivity to light. Understanding how they work together and how you can adjust them can help you take control over the final product of your photos. Next up, mastering the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is a guideline for composition to place our subject off center for more interesting and balanced photos. By placing the subject of the photo at the intersection of the lines created by the rule of thirds, it can create a sense of tension and mystery in the image. It doesn't have to be used with specifically subjects, it can be used with horizon lines and diagonal lines that may be in the image, as you can see here. Next up is leading lines, and I love using leading lines to draw your attention towards the subject. I often will use lights or lines off buildings for the leading lines, but you can use anything that's pointing towards your subject. Here are some examples of what I've used for leading lines. I have drawn on some red lines so you can see how I've used them to point towards the subject. Next up is mastering light and shadow. Now for me, this is probably the most important one. We've all heard the phrase painting with light, and that is essentially what we do when we're creating our photographs. Using light and shadows effectively can create contrast in your images, it can add texture, and it can add to the storytelling. Silhouettes are a great way to tell stories and create a bit of mystery behind that story, and it's something I do a lot, as you can see by the images on screen now. By learning how to play with the direction, intensity, and color of light, you can really create dynamic images that are unique to you. Next up is post-processing, and this is an essential skill that you must master if you want to take your photos to the next level. I personally use Photoshop and Lightroom, but there are obviously loads of different types of softwares available. You can use a phone, but for me, Lightroom, Photoshop on a computer, on a laptop, it's just so much easier, it's so much more effective, and you can give your photos real, unique, individual style, and that's what I'm going to show you very briefly what I do now. Welcome to my Lightroom. This is where I do most of my corrections in terms of color, light, masking. It's where I put my personal touch on things. So what I'm going to do is quickly just go through you which of these makes a difference and how. So for example, the tone curve gives me my punch, the color takes away some of the punchiness of that color, so I have that faded look, which is what I like. The grading then gives me that grade, so it goes from this sort of color here, as you can see, to this nice cooler tones, which is what I'm looking for in my images. The others won't make such a difference unless you like zoom in. So let's go detail. No, I haven't really changed much on that. You might get some difference here. So I've given it some grain to give it some texture, and there's no vignette in there. What I have done as well, you can add masks. So as you can see, the only mask I have is there. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to zoom in to where the mask is, these footprints on the side of my image, and all I've done there is just added a little bit of contrast. As you can see here, some contrast, reduce the shadows just to give that punch, and that's purely just to make them stand out because they are quite hard to see, so it's just to give them that little bit of a punch. What I'll then do is take these images, once I'm happy with the colors, I will then take the images to Photoshop. Once I'm in Photoshop, most of the time it's for cropping. So for example here, I want to crop the image, so I'm going to go 16:9 as that is more cinematic, and that's personally what I prefer. So that is how I will represent that image. Obviously I could cut in a little bit if I wanted to get rid of the bottom and the top, which is kind of like that blackness, but I actually quite like it like that. The other thing I will do is clean up the image. Now, an image like this in street photography generally, I don't need to clean up too much. But for example, if I wanted to get rid of these feet, say I wanted to get rid of them, I might go to a patch tool, go around, and then just slide to the right because its textures are similar. And then that would get rid of the footprint. But I like the footprint, so it's staying. That is an example. Obviously, I'm not going to go into too much detail because we'll be here forever. But that gives you an idea there roughly of what I will use. Once I'm in here, then I will export the image and then put it onto my phone and post it on Instagram or wherever you like to post your stuff. In this case, it's going on YouTube. As you can see there, I use post-processing mostly for shadow, light, and color. There is obviously some composition, cropping involved, but that for me is the most important thing. However, you can obviously go to town with Photoshop and Lightroom. There's so much to do. Clean your images up. You can mask where you put images on top of images, and you can do double exposure. There's so many different things you can do. It's unbelievable. And learning Photoshop and Lightroom and any post-processing will take your photography way beyond that beginner level. Next up on the agenda is knowing your gear. Now, having the best gear in the world isn't essential, but knowing your gear inside out really helps. So earlier we talked about ISO, aperture, shutter speed, and how the aperture triangle can impact on the exposure of your photos, and learning those is mega important, super important. But being able to actually implement them quickly on your camera is equally important. Understanding the capabilities and limitations of your camera is absolutely essential. Knowing how to adjust focus and your exposure is going to be the difference between getting the photo and not getting the photo. The more you practice, the better you'll get. And actually, that brings me nicely onto my seventh and last point, which is practice, practice, practice. Get out there, get taking photos, whether you're a landscape photographer, whether you're a street photographer, whether you're a sport photographer, it doesn't matter. Get out there, practice, try shooting different styles, try shooting different things, try experimenting, try mixing up what you're doing, how you're doing it. Find something that suits you and just practice, practice, practice. It's the best way and the only way you're ever going to get to really know your camera, know the settings, know the style of photos that you love, that suit your eye, and don't just stop there. Read books, watch vlogs, subscribe to YouTube channels, go to workshops, meet other photographers, go and shoot with other photographers because they will give you so much advice, and just keep shooting, keep creating, and you'll get much better at photography, I promise. My name's Nathan Miles, aka NJM Flicks. You can find me on Instagram at NJM Flicks. In fact, you can find me on all socials at NJM Flicks. Hope you enjoyed that video. Hope you found it useful. If you did, please subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.